Emily Wright's return to the United States was nothing short of surreal. The bustling Chicago O'Hare Airport buzzed with life, its halls filled with people rushing to destinations unknown. Emily stood in the arrivals area, her suitcase beside her, scanning the crowd for a familiar face. After years of living in Europe, she felt like a stranger in her own country. But there, among the sea of unfamiliar faces, she spotted her father, Michael, waving enthusiastically. His warm smile was like a beacon, grounding her in the chaos. "Emily!" Michael's deep voice cut through the noise as he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Welcome home, my girl." "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she hugged him back. She could feel the weight of his love and pride in that single moment. For a man who rarely showed vulnerability, Michael's eyes glistened as he stepped back to get a better look at her. "You look amazing. Europe has been good to you," he said, chuckling. Emily smiled. "It's been a journey, but it's good to be back." They made their way to the parking lot, Michael carrying her luggage despite her protests. As they walked, they talked about small things, her flight, the weather in Chicago, and the new additions to the Wright's Emporium. But beneath the surface, Emily could feel the unspoken weight of her return. It wasn't just a homecoming. It was the beginning of something bigger. In the car, as the city skyline came into view, Emily finally broached a topic she'd been rehearsing in her mind for weeks. "Dad, I've been thinking," she began, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "I want to be more involved with the business." Michael glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "Oh, I thought you were done with Wrights when you left for Paris." "I was, for a while. But things have changed. I've changed." She turned to him, her expression earnest. "I've learned so much about sustainable fashion and modern branding. I think I can help take Wright's Emporium in a new direction. Something fresh. Something meaningful." Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but his face softened. "You've always had a vision, Emily. Even when you were a kid, rearranging displays in the store like they were your personal art projects." Emily laughed. "And you put them back the way they were, because your designs were better than mine." "I just didn't want to admit it," he said with a grin. "But seriously, the business could use your touch. It's been thriving, sure, but it's missing that spark. If you're ready to dive in, I'll back you 100%. Emily's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad. I won't let you down." Michael reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "I know you won't. We'll start tomorrow. I'll introduce you to the team at the main store." The next morning, Emily woke up in her childhood bedroom, a flood of memories washing over her. The pastel walls, the shelves filled with books and trophies. It all felt frozen in time. But she wasn't the same girl who had left. She was a woman with a purpose, ready to make her mark. Downstairs, Michael was already dressed and sipping coffee when she joined him. "Ready for your first day back?" he asked, sliding a plate of toast her way. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said, taking a bite. Her nerves buzzed, but she pushed them aside. This was her chance to prove herself, not just to her father, but to everyone who had doubted her. They drove to Wright's Emporium's flagship store in the heart of Chicago. The building was a testament to Michael's vision, sleek, modern, and unmissable. As they stepped inside, Emily felt a mix of pride and apprehension. The store was everything she remembered, polished floors, elegant displays, and an air of exclusivity. But it also felt cold, detached. Michael led her through the store, introducing her to a few staff members along the way. Most greeted her politely, though some seemed surprised or even skeptical to see her. Emily couldn't tell if it was because she was Michael's daughter or something else entirely. As they walked, Michael pointed out key areas of the store: the luxury handbag section, the tailored suits, the custom jewelry counter. "And this," he said, stopping in front of a glass-walled office, "is where you'll be working. For now, at least." Emily peered inside. The office was small but bright, with a view of the bustling store floor. It was a far cry from the sprawling atelier she'd had in Paris, but she didn't mind. It was a start. "Thank you, Dad," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions bubbling inside her. Michael nodded. "You've got a lot of work ahead of you, Em, but I have no doubt you'll rise to the occasion." As they stepped back onto the store floor, Emily took a deep breath. This was her chance to bring her vision to life. Little did she know, her first real challenge was just around the corner. Emily entered Wright's Emporium with a quiet sense of purpose. The store, with its polished floors, high ceilings, and gleaming glass cases, felt both familiar and foreign to her. It was a place that carried the weight of legacy, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her presence here would be different from when she was a child playing among the displays. Today, she was not just Michael Wright's daughter. She was a woman with new ideas and a plan to breathe new life into the family business. As she walked through the aisles, Emily admired the sophisticated layout and carefully curated displays. The clothing racks were arranged with precision, showcasing the kind of luxury that made the store stand out in Chicago's competitive market. Yet, something about the space felt disconnected. The opulence was evident, but there was an undercurrent of exclusivity that seemed to keep some people out, including herself. Her thoughts were interrupted when a security guard, standing near the entrance to the luxury section, gave her an appraising look. His gaze lingered a moment too long, and Emily immediately felt the weight of it. She tried to ignore it, but she couldn't shake the discomfort gnawing at her. It didn't take long for the man to approach her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone formal, almost dismissive. "Could I ask you to step aside for a moment? I need to check your credentials." Emily froze. The sharpness of his words stung more than the formality. She looked at him, confused. "My credentials?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. "I'm Emily Wright. My father owns this store." The security guard's expression didn't change. "Right. Well, we can't just let anyone wander through the high-end section without proper clearance. Do you have a guest pass or identification?" A cold knot formed in Emily's stomach. She had expected to be noticed, to be introduced, but not like this. Not treated as if she didn't belong here. I don't have anything like that with me right now," she stammered. "But I assure you, I'm supposed to be here. My name is Emily Wright." The guard's eyes scanned her once more, and then he spoke in a tone that seemed to grow more dismissive by the second. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave this area, unless you can provide verification." He paused, looking around at the customers in the nearby section. "For your own safety and the store's integrity." Emily's heart sank. Her skin burned with embarrassment, and she felt every eye in the room turned toward her. The judgment was palpable, and the sting of being treated like an outsider in her own family store cut deeper than she expected. "Are you serious?" Emily's voice trembled, but she tried to hold her ground. "I'm Emily Wright. This is my father's store. The security guard didn't let her finish. I don't care who you are. Without proper identification, you can't be here. There was a moment of stunned silence. No one spoke up. No one intervened. It was as if the entire room had collectively decided that Emily didn't matter. The humiliation washed over her, and for a moment, she didn't know what to do. The stares from the customers felt like daggers, and the whispered conversations in the background only amplified her sense of isolation. Feeling her throat tighten, Emily made a decision. She wouldn't waste another second trying to explain herself. With her head held high, she turned on her heel and walked out of the store. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed to dim as she passed through the entrance, and the weight of the world seemed to settle onto her shoulders. The moment she stepped outside, the cool Chicago air hit her face, offering a brief reprieve from the stifling atmosphere inside. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, trying to steady herself, but the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. The anger, the confusion, the frustration all poured out in a rush. What had just happened? Was this what she could expect from the world she was trying to change? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her father. "Everything okay, Em? I'll meet you in 15. Emily wiped her eyes quickly, forcing herself to calm down. She couldn't let him see her like this. Not yet. Not until she figured out what this really meant for her plans, for everything she had hoped to accomplish by returning home. With a deep breath, she typed back, "I'm fine, just a little overwhelmed. I'll meet you soon." When she arrived at the parking lot, Michael was waiting by his car. He looked up as she approached, his face lighting up with concern. "What's going on, Emily?" he asked, his voice filled with unease. "What happened in there?" Emily hesitated for a moment, but then she found herself speaking, the words tumbling out. I was treated like I didn't belong, Dad. I was humiliated in front of everyone. The security guard didn't believe who I was. He thought I was some random person wandering through the store, and no one said anything. Not a single person stepped in to help. Michael's face turned pale, and for the first time since her return, Emily saw the guilt in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I don't know what to say. That's not acceptable." "Not acceptable?" Emily's voice cracked, her frustration boiling over. "It's worse than that, Dad. It's about more than just a mistake. It's about how people see me. It's about how they see us, like we don't belong in places that are supposed to be ours." Michael sighed deeply, his gaze distant. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know it was like that for you." "That's the problem, Dad," Emily replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "You didn't know, but I've been living it for years." Michael looked at her, his expression softening. "We'll fix this, Emily. I promise you, we'll fix it. No one will treat you like that again. I'll make sure of it." Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel as she drove home, her thoughts swirling. The drive from the store had felt like a blur, her mind still racing from the humiliation she had just endured. The feeling of being treated like an outsider, a stranger in her own father's business, stung deeply. She had hoped for a warm welcome, a chance to prove herself, but instead, she had been reduced to nothing more than an intruder. When she arrived home, the familiar sight of the family house felt distant. The cozy living room, with its worn leather chairs and the faint scent of her father's cologne, should have been comforting. But today it seemed like another world. She stepped inside and was met by the warm glow of the lights and the soft hum of the television. Michael, her father, was sitting in his favorite chair, reading a business magazine. He looked up as Emily entered, his face lighting up with a smile. But when he saw her expression, the smile faded. "Hey, kiddo, you okay?" Michael asked, setting down the magazine and standing up. His eyes searched her face for any sign of what might be troubling her. Emily didn't answer immediately. She walked past him and into the hallway, her chest tightening as she tried to hold back the tears. She could feel them welling up, but she didn't want to break down in front of him. Not like this. What happened?" Michael's voice was gentle now, filled with concern. He followed her into the hallway, his footsteps slow, as if not wanting to push too hard. Emily paused at the door to her room, her hand resting on the knob as she turned to face him. The dam broke. "Dad, I was humiliated today. The moment I stepped foot in the store, I was treated like I didn't belong, like I wasn't even worthy of being there." Michael's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? Was it a mistake? Someone gave you a hard time?" She shook her head, trying to steady her voice. "It wasn't just a mistake, Dad. A security guard came up to me like I was some thief, asking for papers, telling me not to touch anything. He had no idea who I was. And then the customers, no one said a word. They all just watched, like it was normal." Her voice cracked, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. "I wasn't just being treated like a customer, Dad. I was being treated like I didn't exist, like I was invisible. And it's because of the way I look." The words stung as they left her mouth. She had known it was true, but saying it out loud made it feel all the more real. Emily could feel her heart racing, the rush of anger and hurt mingling together. She had hoped that things would be different when she came back home, when she came back to the family business. But this felt like an assault on her very identity. Michael stood there for a moment, silent, as though the weight of her words had taken him by surprise. He hadn't seen it, hadn't felt it the way she had, the kind of subtle cruelty that cut deeper than any physical blow. "Emily, He stopped himself, his voice quiet. "I never thought." "Exactly." Emily cut him off, her frustration bubbling over. "You never thought about it, Dad. You never had to. You're white. You walk through the world without anyone questioning your right to be anywhere. But me? Every step I take, I feel it. Every moment I walk into a room, I wonder if I'm going to have to fight to be seen for who I really am." The silence between them hung heavy. Michael shifted uneasily, unsure of how to respond. He had always been proud of his daughter, of her strength and her accomplishments. But this? He had no idea how deeply racism had affected her, how it had shaped her view of the world. I had no idea," he began, his voice thick with guilt. "I didn't know it was that bad for you. I thought you could handle it. You've always been so strong, so sure of yourself." Emily shook her head. "I am strong, Dad, but that doesn't mean I don't feel the weight of this. And it doesn't mean I shouldn't expect to be treated with respect." Michael walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. The warmth of his touch was a small comfort, but it didn't take away the sting of what had happened. "I'm sorry, Em. I should have protected you from this. I promise you, we're going to fix this. We're going to make sure that no one else ever makes you feel the way that man did today." Emily looked up at him, her eyes still wet with unshed tears, but there was a flicker of hope in them. Don't want just an apology, Dad. I want action. I want things to change at that store. I want them to know that I'm not some outsider. I'm your daughter, and I have a place there, just like everyone else." Michael nodded slowly, his expression hardening with resolve. "You're right. You're right, Emily. We'll make it happen. I'll make sure of it." The promise hung in the air between them, a vow to confront the darkness of prejudice and create something better. But Emily knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was. And yet, in that moment, she could feel a shift, a flicker of possibility. Things would change. She would make sure of it. The next few days felt like an emotional roller coaster for Emily. The promise her father had made to her had been reassuring, but she couldn't shake the anger and frustration that still gnawed at her. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the events at the store, the way the security guard had looked at her, as if she were invisible, as if she didn't belong. It burned inside her. Despite her emotional turmoil, she tried to focus on what her father had said. Michael had taken immediate action, reaching out to the management of the store and making it clear that Emily was part of the family, part of the company, and should never have been treated the way she had been. It felt like a small victory, but Emily knew this was just the beginning. There was still so much more to do, and she needed to prove herself, not just to the people who'd wronged her, but to herself. Later that week, Emily received a call from the store manager. He wanted to meet her in person, sitting at the table in a local cafe. Emily was tense, her fingers tapping nervously against her coffee cup. She had dressed carefully for the meeting, not too flashy, but not overly casual either. She wanted to appear both professional and assertive. She had no intention of letting this slide, no matter what. The door opened and the manager, Mr. Hawkins, stepped inside. He was a tall man with graying hair, wearing a sharp suit. His face was strained as he approached Emily, his eyes avoiding hers for a brief moment. "Miss Davis, thank you for agreeing to meet me," he said, pulling out the chair across from her. "Let's get straight to the point," Emily replied, her voice steady but cold. She didn't want pleasantries. She wanted accountability. Hawkins cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I want to start by saying how sorry I am for what happened last week. I've reviewed the security footage, and I've spoken with the guard in question. His behavior was completely unacceptable. I've also spoken to the staff involved, and they've all been reminded of our policies regarding diversity and respect for all customers." Emily's eyes narrowed. "That's a start, Mr. Hawkins, but it's not enough. I've been in that store before, and this wasn't the first time something like this has happened. People don't just treat you like an outsider once and then forget. No, there's a bigger problem here, and it's one you need to address, not just with policies, but with real change." Hawkins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I understand your frustration, Miss Davis, and I want you to know that this is being taken seriously. We're implementing a mandatory training program on diversity and inclusion for all staff. And as a gesture of goodwill, I'd like to invite you to speak at our next company meeting." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You want me to speak?" "Yes, I believe it could be beneficial. You've experienced firsthand the kind of behavior that needs to be addressed. You have a unique perspective, and I think the staff could learn from your story." Emily leaned back in her chair, considering his words. There was something about the idea of speaking to the staff that felt right. This wasn't just about confronting one incident. It was about addressing the bigger issue, making sure that the message about respect and inclusion was heard loud and clear. She could do that. "I'll speak," she said, her voice firm. "But I need more than just a gesture. I need to see real changes. If I'm going to help, I need you to commit to an action plan, one that involves not just the staff but the customers too. Make it clear that this kind of treatment will not be tolerated." Hawkins nodded. "You have my word, Miss Davis. We'll make sure this isn't just lip service. I want you to feel safe and valued in our store, and I'll make sure our staff understand that moving forward." Emily felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was progress. She'd forced the conversation to go deeper, and now she had a platform to ensure that things didn't just go back to business as usual. She wasn't just a victim in this scenario. She was going to be a catalyst for change. After the meeting, Emily walked out of the cafe, her steps purposeful. As much as she wanted to feel relieved, there was still a part of her that was on edge. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. People didn't change overnight, especially when it came to deeply ingrained attitudes. But she had to start somewhere. And today, she had made her voice heard. Later that evening, Emily returned home. The house was quiet, and her father was in the study, working late as usual. She stood for a moment at the door, watching him. She hadn't told him about the meeting yet, but she knew he'd be proud of her. She also knew that even though things were moving in the right direction, there would be more battles to fight. She walked into the study, where her father was hunched over his desk. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice softer than she'd expected. She hadn't realized how much she needed to talk about the meeting with him until now. Michael looked up, his face brightening when he saw her. "How did it go?" he asked. Emily smiled faintly and sat down across from him. "It went better than I thought it would. They're going to implement some changes, but I made it clear that this can't be a one-off. They need to change the culture, not just the surface stuff." Her father nodded. "I'm proud of you, Emily. You're not just letting this go. You're standing up for what's right." Emily leaned back in the chair, letting out a sigh of relief. For the first time in days, she felt like a weight had been lifted, even if just a little. It wasn't over yet, but it was a step in the right direction. As she looked out of the study window, she knew that her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for every person who had ever felt invisible. She would keep pushing, keep speaking up, and make sure no one else had to endure what she had. The weeks following Emily's meeting with Mr. Hawkins were a whirlwind of progress and internal struggle. On one hand, she was satisfied that her message had been heard. The store had indeed implemented new diversity and inclusion programs, and the staff was now undergoing training. On the other hand, the anger from the incident still simmered inside her. Every time she walked past that store, she couldn't shake the memory of the way she'd been treated, how invisible she'd felt. It was hard to let that feeling go, even if things were changing. One morning, Emily received an unexpected call. It was from a news outlet. They had caught wind of her meeting with the store manager and wanted to know more about her experience. Emily hesitated for a moment. Speaking publicly could bring attention to her cause, but it also meant revisiting painful memories. Still, she knew she couldn't remain silent. If her story could inspire others, if it could bring about real change, then it was worth it. "Hello." Emily answered the phone, her voice steady, though she felt a knot in her stomach. "Hi, this is Rachel from the Evening News. We heard about the incident you experienced at the store and the subsequent changes they've made. We'd love to hear your side of the story. Are you willing to speak with us?" Emily took a deep breath. This was it, her chance to break the silence. "Yes, I'll talk." Arrangements were made for a meeting later that day at a local cafe, a quiet spot away from prying eyes. When Emily arrived, she found Rachel waiting for her at a small table, a notebook in hand and a microphone on the table. She looked professional, but her demeanor was warm, inviting. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Rachel said as Emily sat down. "Of course," Emily replied, offering a small smile. "I believe it's important that people hear what happened. There's still a lot to address, but we need to start somewhere." Rachel nodded, flipping open her notebook. "Let's start with the basics. Can you tell me what happened the day of the incident at the store?" Emily took a deep breath and began recounting the events. She spoke about the way the security guard had treated her, the humiliation she'd felt, and the realization that it wasn't just a random act of discrimination, but part of a larger, systemic problem. As she spoke, she could feel the weight of the memories pressing down on her, but she also felt a sense of power in her words. This was her story, and it needed to be heard. Rachel listened intently, occasionally nodding and jotting down notes. When Emily finished, Rachel looked up at her. "It's clear that what happened to you wasn't just an isolated incident," she said, her voice gentle. "But what really stands out is your reaction to it. You didn't just walk away. You fought for what's right." Emily felt a mix of emotions. Part of her was still angry, still hurt by what had happened, but another part of her was proud. She had taken control of the situation in a way she hadn't thought possible. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was a force for change. "I couldn't walk away," Emily said firmly. "I'm tired of people like me being silenced, ignored, or treated like we don't matter. This fight isn't just mine. It's for everyone who's ever felt invisible." Rachel smiled, clearly impressed. "And now, because of your actions, things are changing. The store is making real efforts to educate their staff, and you're giving a voice to others who may be too afraid to speak up. How does that feel?" Emily paused for a moment, considering the question. She had always been the quiet one, the one who kept her head down and avoided confrontation. But now, she felt different, stronger, more determined. "It feels like a beginning," Emily said. "I don't know where this will lead, but I know I'm not alone. And that's the most important part of all." As the interview wrapped up, Emily felt a sense of relief. Speaking her truth had been cathartic, but it had also opened a door to something bigger. She wasn't just advocating for herself anymore. She was standing up for every person who had ever been made to feel less than invisible or small. Later that night, Emily sat with her father at the dinner table, the clinking of silverware the only sound between them. Michael had seen the news story. Of course, he didn't need to say much to let Emily know he was proud of her. She could see it in his eyes. "You did good today," he said simply after a long pause. "You're not just fighting for yourself, Emily. You're fighting for everyone who's been treated like they don't belong. That's a fight worth having." She smiled, grateful for his support. "Thanks, Dad. It feels right." The next few weeks brought a flurry of media attention. Emily's story was shared across social media, and more people began to speak out about their own experiences with discrimination. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a movement, a collective call for change. But even as she basked in the praise and the support, Emily knew there was more work to do. The store had made changes, yes, but there were other places, other people who still needed to learn. She couldn't stop now. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. And so, Emily kept pushing. Every conversation she had, every meeting she attended, every speech she gave, it all became part of the larger mission to make sure that the world didn't forget what had happened, to make sure no one else would ever have to endure the same kind of treatment. As she lay in bed one night, thinking about everything that had happened, Emily knew one thing for sure. She had found her voice, and she wasn't about to let it go. The days that followed Emily's interview were a whirlwind of attention. Her story had gone viral, spreading across social media and inspiring people from all walks of life. Messages of support flooded in from people who had experienced similar discrimination, from those who had never considered the weight of such issues, and from activists who had been fighting for change for years. Emily was no longer just a woman with a story to tell. She was becoming the face of a movement. Despite the overwhelming flood of support, the pressure weighed heavily on her. She found herself constantly fielding calls from the media, attending interviews, and being approached by strangers in public places. Everyone wanted a piece of her. The attention, although flattering, was exhausting. Emily needed space to breathe, to think, to reclaim her own narrative. One evening, after a particularly draining interview, Emily found herself walking through the park near her apartment. The quiet surroundings, the soft rustling of leaves, and the evening air helped her regain a sense of calm. She sat on a bench, taking in the serenity. It was a rare moment of peace in a life that had been suddenly filled with noise. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from M. Hawkins, the manager of the store. She had been wondering when she'd hear from him again. His last email had promised that the store was implementing more significant changes, but she hadn't yet seen the full impact of those changes. "Hey, Emily," the message began. "I just wanted to let you know that we've taken additional steps to make sure that what happened doesn't happen again. We're implementing a comprehensive training program for all staff on diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias. We want to do more than just check a box. We want to build a culture of respect. Thank you for your patience and for giving us the chance to get this right." Emily felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she read his words. She'd expected change, but seeing it in action, real, tangible steps, was something different. It was one thing to speak about change, but another entirely to make it happen. M. Hawkins was proving that he meant it. She didn't reply right away, instead sitting with the news, letting it sink in. Later that evening, Emily attended a community event where local leaders were discussing issues of racial inequality in their town. She was introduced as a guest speaker, and despite her nerves, she stepped onto the stage, prepared to speak her truth once more. The crowd was diverse, made up of community activists, local politicians, and ordinary people who had come to listen. Emily could feel the eyes of the room on her as she stepped up to the podium, the weight of their expectations almost palpable. "Thank you all for having me here tonight," she began, her voice steady. "I never imagined I would be standing here, sharing my experience with all of you. But here I am, and I'm grateful for the opportunity." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Some were familiar from the protests. Others were new. But all of them were united by a common purpose: to fight for a better, fairer world. "I want to tell you about something that happened to me. Something that, for a long time, I kept to myself. It wasn't just the way I was treated at that store. It was a realization that I am not the only one who's been treated this way. Every day, people are discriminated against in ways that are invisible to most, but painfully real to those who experience them. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words. I didn't expect to be a voice for change, but sometimes change finds you. And I realized that if I stay silent, nothing changes. So here I am, speaking for those who feel like they don't have a voice. And we're not going to stop until everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. The crowd was silent for a moment, and then one by one, people began to clap. First softly, then louder. Emily felt the energy in the room shift, a collective sense of purpose filling the air. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel proud, not for the attention she received, but for the change she was helping to create. After her speech, Emily was approached by several people who shared their own experiences of discrimination. Each story was different, but they all carried the same theme. People who had been overlooked, disrespected, or mistreated because of who they were. And yet, despite the pain in their voices, there was a shared resilience, a commitment to continue fighting. As she spoke with these individuals, Emily's sense of purpose grew even stronger. The work wasn't over. Far from it. But she was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was an active participant in the fight for justice, and that was something that no one could take away from her. Later that night, Emily sat in her apartment, reflecting on the day. She thought about the people she had met, the stories they had shared, and the collective determination she had witnessed. The path ahead was still long, and the fight for racial justice was far from won. But Emily knew that as long as she kept speaking out, as long as she kept pushing for change, there was hope. She picked up her phone and sent a message to M. Hawkins, simply saying, "Thank you for doing the right thing. Together, we can make a difference." She sat back, a sense of peace settling over her. The fight was far from over, but she was no longer fighting alone. The days that followed Emily's speech were filled with quiet triumphs. The ripple effect of her words had spread far beyond the event, reaching corners of the city she hadn't imagined. In the weeks after her public appearance, she received letters, calls, and messages from people across the country who had been moved by her honesty. They shared their own stories of racism, struggles, and victories. Emily had become a symbol for many, an ordinary woman who had found the courage to speak out and ignite change. One afternoon, Emily was sitting at a cafe, catching up on her emails, when a familiar name appeared in her inbox, M. Hawkins. It was an update on the store's progress, but this time, it carried a more personal tone. He was inviting her to a meeting with the store's board of directors. They wanted to discuss her potential involvement in shaping their diversity and inclusion training program. Emily was stunned. This wasn't just a response to a single incident anymore. This was a full commitment to reimagining the company's culture. M. Hawkins had made good on his promise, and now they wanted her expertise to ensure their changes were lasting. The following week, Emily walked into the store's corporate office, feeling a sense of both excitement and uncertainty. She had never been in such a high-stakes setting before, but she knew that what she was about to do mattered more than any meeting she had ever attended. She had come full circle, from the woman who was wrong to the person now sitting at the table to create change for others. The boardroom was sleek, polished, and intimidating. A large window stretched across the wall, offering a view of the city skyline. But Emily's attention was fixed on the group of executives sitting around the table. There was M. Hawkins, a few other senior members of the company, and a diversity consultant who had been hired to guide them through this process. Emily M. Hawkins greeted her warmly. "We're glad you could join us today. We've been following your work, and it's clear you've had a profound impact, not just in your community, but beyond it. We want to do more than just apologize. We want to make this right, and we think you can help us." Emily sat down, a little overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation, but also grateful for the opportunity. She listened as they explained their plans to overhaul the store's operations, from new policies on customer treatment to mandatory bias training for all employees, including top executives. They wanted her to be part of a task force that would hold the company accountable, ensuring they followed through on their promises. "Where do we start?" Emily asked, her voice steady. The consultant smiled, recognizing the sincerity in her question. "We start by listening. We start by hearing from those who have felt unheard for too long. And we start by being willing to be uncomfortable." The meeting stretched on for hours, but it was clear to Emily that this wasn't just another corporate initiative. The store was genuinely committed to real change. They were ready to make difficult decisions, implement policies that might alienate some of their customers, and dedicate resources to making sure that inclusivity wasn't just a buzzword, but a practice ingrained in everything they did. When the meeting ended, Emily felt a sense of accomplishment. She hadn't just been a witness to change. She had helped shape it. She walked out of the building with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that this was only the beginning. Her voice was not only being heard, it was now being respected. But with this new role came new challenges. As she navigated the complexities of corporate decision-making, she also faced backlash. Not everyone was happy with the changes taking place at the store. Some loyal customers had taken to social media to voice their displeasure, accusing the company of caving to the woke agenda. Emily found herself reading harsh comments on the store's online platforms, questioning whether this was the right move. She had been prepared for resistance, but the personal attack stung. She reminded herself that progress was never easy, and the hard road often came with the loudest critics. Still, there were moments when the weight of the negativity made her question if this path was worth it. One afternoon, after a particularly tough meeting, Emily sat down on the couch at her apartment and closed her eyes. The steady beat of her heart seemed to drown out the noise for a moment. She thought about her mother, who had always taught her to rise above adversity, to keep her head held high in the face of challenge. Emily's mother had endured far worse. The least Emily could do was endure a few harsh words from people who didn't understand the fight. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Mia, a friend who had been with her through everything. "Hey, just wanted to check in. You're doing amazing work, Em. Don't let the haters get to you." Emily smiled, comforted by the message. Mia's words were a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. She had built a support system, and together, they could weather any storm. The next day, Emily received a call from a local news station. They wanted to do a follow-up interview with her, focusing on the changes at the store and her role in making them happen. It was another chance to amplify the message that change was not only possible but happening right now. As Emily prepared for the interview, she reflected on how far she had come. The woman who had walked into that store weeks ago, with a heart full of anger and frustration, had transformed into someone who was not just advocating for herself, but for an entire community. She had seen the power of speaking out, and now she was part of something much bigger than herself, a movement that could not be silenced. When the camera lights turned on, Emily felt ready. She wasn't just a woman telling her story anymore. She was a force for change, and this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed Emily's televised interview marked a turning point, both for her and for the store. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People from all walks of life, those who had supported her from the start, and even those who had initially been skeptical, reached out to express their admiration. Emily's courage, her willingness to speak out, and her persistence had left an indelible mark on the city. But what struck her the most was how many people had begun sharing their own stories of overcoming obstacles, of finding strength in the face of adversity. It was as though her voice had opened a door for others to do the same. Despite the positive feedback, there was still work to be done. Emily's role at the store had evolved from being a consultant to a key member of the Diversity and Inclusion Board. She worked closely with store management to implement new policies, ensuring that they weren't just reactive, but proactive in addressing the issues that had sparked the initial conflict. They introduced more workshops, training sessions, and community engagement events to create a space where people felt safe and valued, regardless of their background. One of the biggest changes was the store's initiative to partner with local organizations that supported underrepresented communities, particularly those affected by racial discrimination. They created programs that helped provide job training, mentorship, and scholarships for young people from marginalized backgrounds. Emily had a hand in shaping these programs, and as she saw them take off, it became clear to her that change wasn't just about policies. It was about creating lasting opportunities. But the work wasn't always easy. Emily still faced resistance, particularly from people who didn't understand why these changes were necessary. There were whispers, social media rants, and angry emails from customers who felt that the store was catering to a political agenda. Some of the more vocal critics even organized boycotts, encouraging others to stop shopping at the store. Emily knew that change was often met with opposition, but it didn't make it any easier. At times, she questioned if they were doing enough or if they were moving fast enough. One evening, after another round of tense meetings with management, Emily sat alone in her office at the store. The city lights outside flickered in the distance, but inside, the weight of the day hung heavy. She thought about her own journey, the moments of doubt, the painful conversations, the times she felt like giving up. But then she remembered the emails, the messages of support, the people who believed in the change she was helping to create. She thought about her mother's lessons, about standing firm, about not letting the fear of conflict keep her from fighting for what was right. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Mia. "I saw your interview. You're doing amazing things. Don't let the haters get to you. You're changing lives." Emily smiled, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. She typed a quick reply. "Thanks, Mia. I'm not sure how much more I can do, but I'm trying. One step at a time." The next morning, as she walked into the store for another day of work, Emily was surprised to see a group of employees gathered at the entrance. They were holding signs, but these weren't the signs of protest. These were messages of solidarity. "Change starts here," one sign read. "Together we rise," said another. It was a spontaneous show of support from the staff, many of whom had participated in the training programs and felt firsthand the impact of the new policies. Emily's heart swelled with pride as she approached the group. Hawkins stepped forward, smiling. "We're all in this together, Emily," he said. "This is the future we're building." In that moment, everything Emily had worked for Every conversation, every uncomfortable meeting, every sleepless night felt worth it. The fight for change had never been easy, but she realized that it had never been about the destination. It was about the journey, the people she had met along the way, and the collective effort to create something better for everyone. Later that afternoon, Emily was invited to a community event where she was honored for her contributions. The local mayor was there, as well as several business leaders, all eager to praise her for her work. As Emily took the stage to speak, she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had come a long way since the day she'd stood in the store, confronting the painful reality of discrimination. Now, she was part of a movement that was changing not just the store, but the entire community. As she looked out at the crowd, she realized that this was just the beginning. There was still so much more to do, so many more voices to amplify, and so many more barriers to break down. But in this moment, Emily knew that she had become more than just a symbol. She had become a catalyst for change, and that change was unstoppable.